Every philosophical argument about consciousness philosophy for sleep, close your eyes for a moment and turn your attention inward. You find a world of thoughts, sensations, memories, a rich tapestry of experience that is yours alone. This is consciousness, the mysterious inner light of awareness that each of us carries. We all know directly what it feels like to be ourselves. Yet when we ask what consciousness is or how it is possible, the answers do not come easily. Our own mind is at once the most familiar thing and the greatest mystery. For centuries, philosophers have struggled to explain this miracle of the mind. Is your consciousness something more than the physical matter of your brain, perhaps an immaterial soul, or is it nothing but brain activity? How can the subjective feeling of red or pain arise from mere chemical and electrical processes? Why does it feel like anything to be alive at all? Can the mind be fully explained by science? Or is there an explanatory gap between physical matter and inner experience that we cannot bridge? These questions are not just academic. They strike at the heart of how we see ourselves in the universe. Over the years, many answers have been proposed, each with its own insights and challenges. In this calm exploration, we will journey through every major philosophical argument about consciousness. We will visit the dualists who separate mind from body, the materialists who see mind as matter, the idealists who claim that everything is mind, and more. We'll consider classic thought experiments that reveal consciousness's perplexities, from a philosopher doubting his own existence to a scientist in a colorless room, from hypothetical zombies with no inner life to futuristic machines that might think. At each stop, we'll pause and reflect, examining all sides of the argument, skeptic and believer, scientist and mystic, without rushing to any final verdict. We begin at the dawn of modern philosophy with the figure who set the terms of the debate. In the 17th century, a man named René Descartes sat alone by a fire and resolved to doubt everything. Everything, that is, except the reality of his own mind. From this act of radical doubt came a new vision of mind and body, a vision that would shape centuries of thought. Our journey starts with Descartes and the birth of dualism. Part 1. Descartes and the birth of dualism. René Descartes began his inquiry into mind and body by doubting everything he could. In his meditations, he imagined that perhaps the physical world, even his own body, might not exist or could be an illusion. But there was one thing Descartes found he could not doubt: the existence of his own mind, the conscious self doing the doubting. In a flash of clarity, he concluded, "I think, therefore I am." Whatever else might be false, the reality of his thinking, experiencing mind was indubitable. This moment of certainty laid the cornerstone for Descartes' philosophy of consciousness. From this foundation, Descartes drew a bold distinction between mind and body. The mind, in his view, is not a physical thing at all. It is a non-material substance, an immaterial soul whose essence is to think. The body, by contrast, is purely material, a machine of flesh and bone occupying space. Mind and matter are, as Descartes envisioned them, two utterly different kinds of substance, each with its own nature. The mind has no size or location, but it possesses consciousness, thoughts, desires, feelings. The body is extended in space, measurable and divisible, but by itself is mindless. This view, that mental phenomena are fundamentally non-physical, and that the mind is distinct and separable from the body, is known as mind-body dualism. Descartes' dualism gave Western thought a new framework for understanding consciousness. It aligned well with spiritual intuitions and religious doctrines of the soul. If mind and body are separate, one can imagine a mind or soul living on even if the body dies. It also resonated with common sense. Even today, many people feel that their conscious self, me, the thinker inside, is not identical with their material brain or body, but something fundamentally different. Dualism preserves a sense of human beings as more than mere machines. Yet Descartes' vision raised perhaps more questions than it answered. If mind and matter are totally different substances, how do they interact? How can an immaterial thought cause a material body to move? And how can physical events in the brain give rise to subjective experiences in a non-physical mind? Even Descartes' contemporaries were puzzled. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia famously pressed him, if the mind has no extension in space, how can it push around the particles of the body? Descartes speculated that the interaction might occur in the pineal gland deep in the brain, but this was more of a guess than a satisfying theory. The difficulty of explaining mind-body interaction became the classic weakness of dualism. Later critics would ridicule the notion of a ghost-like mind somehow pulling the levers of a biological machine. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle would later joke that Descartes had given us a ghost in the machine, an invisible, inexplicable pilot steering the body. Still, dualism has proven enduring. Variants of mind-body dualism persisted through the centuries, and even today, a number of philosophers defend versions of it. The appeal is understandable. Dualism recognizes the seemingly special, irreducible quality of our inner life. It doesn't try to explain away consciousness as just physics and chemistry. It grants our mental life its own fundamental status. For anyone who feels that thoughts and feelings just couldn't be the same thing as electrochemical reactions, dualism offers a reassuring framework. But it comes at a cost. The divide it creates between mind and matter makes the actual workings of consciousness deeply enigmatic. How can two such different realms come together? Dualism answers that they somehow do, but not how. This unresolved tension in Descartes' legacy would soon provoke a backlash. Philosophers began to ask, what if the ghost in the machine is a myth? What if there is no separate soul at all? With this challenge, the pendulum swings, and the story of consciousness takes a very different turn. Part 2. The Rise of Behaviorism. No room for mind? By the early 20th century, a very different attitude toward the mind had gained momentum. Behaviorism swept through psychology and philosophy with a call to abandon the invisible mind of dualism and a focus only on outward behavior. Behaviorists were unimpressed by Descartes' introspective certainty or by anyone's private mental experiences. Such subjective things, they argued, could not be scientifically observed or measured. Psychology, they insisted, should restrict itself to what can be seen and quantified: actions, responses, observable behavior. In this view, talk of an inner conscious mind was unnecessary or even meaningless. There was no measurable ghost in the machine. There was only the machine behaving. In 1913, American psychologist John B. Watson declared that psychology must discard all reference to consciousness and become a purely objective science of behavior. Watson even boasted that, given control of a dozen healthy infants, he could train any one of them to become any type of specialist he chose: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, even beggar or thief, regardless of their backgrounds. Around the same time, philosophers influenced by this empiricist spirit took a similar stance. They developed logical behaviorism, a theory that any statement about a mental state can be translated into a statement about observable behavior or dispositions to behave. Saying Alice is angry just means that Alice is scowling, raising her voice, perhaps slamming doors. In short, exhibiting angry behavior or prepared to. There's no need to imagine some inner fury behind the behavior. The behavioral description is all that anger amounts to. Likewise, to have a belief or desire is not to harbor a mysterious mental object. It is simply to be prone to act in certain ways under certain circumstances. By redefining mental terms in this way, behaviorists aim to remove mysterious inner entities from the equation. The mind becomes essentially a black box that we don't peek inside. We just record what goes in, stimuli, and what comes out, responses. If we can predict and control the outputs from the inputs, we have explained everything worth explaining. Gilbert Ryle, a prominent philosophical behaviorist, attacked Descartes' dualism as a colossal mistake, a category mistake. According to Ryle, Descartes treated the mind as if it were a thing of the same sort as the body, only invisible, essentially a spiritual object where thoughts happen. But to Ryle, this was like thinking of a university as an extra building over and above all the classrooms, or thinking of a team's spirit as a separate player on the field. The mind is not an object or a ghostly substance at all. It is just a way of talking about patterns of behavior. Behaviorism brought a refreshing rigor to the study of mind. By insisting on observable evidence and shunning metaphysical speculation, it helped establish psychology as a more scientific discipline. It also had a kind of austere philosophical appeal. It sliced through centuries of mind-body wrangling by simply eliminating mind as a metaphysical problem. If all mental talk is really about behavior, the hard question, what is consciousness, could be set aside as misguided. One could, in theory, explain everything about human beings by describing what they do without ever appealing to an inner mental realm. And yet, for all its influence, strict behaviorism would come to be seen as deeply unsatisfying. Critics argued that the behaviorists, in banishing the ghost, had thrown out something essential, experience itself. After all, we don't just behave, we feel. A theory of mind that ignores the first-person quality of our pains, pleasures, and thoughts. The very consciousness that makes the mind what it is seems to miss the point. In a famous example, a perfect actor might simulate pain behavior, wincing, crying out, without actually feeling pain. If behaviorism were correct, that situation would be identical to real pain, since the outward behavior is the same. But intuitively, there's a world of difference between genuine suffering and an outward imitation of it. The behaviorist account, focused only on external actions, leaves that difference unexplained. By the late 1950s and 1960s, psychologists and philosophers alike were moving beyond the black box approach. The cognitive revolution in psychology brought back talk of internal mental processes, memory, attention, imagery, and philosophers developed new theories that acknowledged internal mental states while trying to remain scientifically respectable. Behaviorism, in its pure form, faded from the scene, having made its mark but unable to fully account for the reality of consciousness. However, the behaviorist rebellion against dualism was not in vain. They had cast serious doubt on the idea of a separable, immaterial mind and refocused attention on the physical organism. The legacy of behaviorism would feed directly into the next great perspective on consciousness, an unapologetically materialist view which holds that mind is matter. Part 3. Physicalism. The mind as the brain, the failure of strict behaviorism paved the way for a triumphant return of the materialist outlook. If the mind isn't a mysterious soul, and it isn't an idle fiction, perhaps it is simply the brain. This is the doctrine of physicalism, the view that conscious minds are entirely physical, embodied in the machinery of the nervous system. In the mid-20th century, as neuroscience began mapping the brain in earnest, philosophers proposed that every mental state just is a brain state. Your feeling of joy when you listen to a symphony, your memory of childhood summers, your deliberation over a difficult choice. All these experiences, say the physicalists, are nothing more and nothing less than physical processes firing away in billions of neurons. The once dreaded ghost turns out to be the electrical dance of neurons. The mind is what the brain does. This approach, often called the mind-brain identity theory, was a direct response to the failure of behaviorism. Philosophers like J.J.C. Smart and U.T. Place argued that it's perfectly coherent, indeed scientifically plausible, to identify mental states with brain states, just as we learn to identify lightning with electrical discharge or water with H2O. The old dualist idea of a separate mental substance was unnecessary. For every type of mental experience, there exists a corresponding physical process in the brain, and that process is the experience. If we had complete scientific knowledge, we could, in principle, point to a pattern of neural firing and say that is Alice's feeling of fear just as confidently as we now know that a particular molecule is a unit of water. In this view, a sensation like pain simply is the activation of specific nerve fibers and nothing more mysterious than that. Physicalism has a lot going for it. It offers a parsimonious, one-world picture. Everything is physical, so we don't have to puzzle over how two different realms interact. There is only the physical realm. The evidence strongly supports a close connection between brain activity and mental activity. Changes in the brain through injury, drugs, or stimulation produce changes in consciousness, and advanced brain imaging can even detect, to an extent, what a person is thinking or feeling by observing neural patterns. It stands to reason, say physicalists, that consciousness arises from the brain in the same way that heat arises from molecular motion or life arises from biological cells. This view transforms the mind-body problem into a straightforward scientific question. How does the brain produce the mind? Not whether it does, that is assumed, but by what mechanism. However, the mind-brain identity theory in its earliest form encounter complication. If we say a particular mental state, like pain, is identical to a particular physical state, say C-fiber activation in human nerves, what do we make of beings that lack human neurons? Can a dog or an octopus feel pain if their brain architecture is different and they have no C-fibers? The intuition is that, of course, they can. Pain is a more general phenomenon, not tied to one specific biology. Similarly, if aliens from another planet or even a future computer system felt emotions or saw colors, must their physical makeup mirror ours exactly? Probably not. This suggests that mental states are a bit more abstract than a one-to-one identification with specific human neural configurations. In philosophical terms, mental states might be multiply realizable. The same kind of mental state could be realized by different physical substrates. A human, a cat, and an intelligent robot might all experience something like pain, but the human's pain is C-fibers firing. The cat's might be a different neural pattern, and the robots might be electronic signals. Yet in an important functional sense, they share the same mental state of being in pain. This line of thought indicated that while physicalism is likely true, mind arises from matter. The simple identity theory might be too narrow. We needed a way to talk about mental states at a higher level of abstraction, in terms of what they do, not the exact physical stuff that does it. And so, materialist thinking about mind evolved toward a new model, functionalism. Part 4. Functionalism. Mind as function if identity theorists oversimplified by pinning each mental state to a specific biological structure. Functionalism offered a more flexible blueprint. Functionalism says, don't worry about what a mind is made of. Focus on what it does. In this view, a mental state is defined by its function or role in the overall system of the mind, not by its particular physical embodiment. Just as a clock can be made of gears and springs or of electronic circuits and LEDs. Either way it tells time. A mind could in principle be made of neurons or silicon chips or alien biology as long as the components play the right functional roles. What are those roles? They are the causal connections, inputs from the environment, outputs in behavior, and interactions with other internal states. For example, what makes something a pain as a mental state isn't that it's C-fibers or any specific tissue. It's that it tends to be caused by bodily injury, produces aversive reactions like saying, ouch, or withdrawing, and leads to other mental states like distress or a desire for relief. Anything that performs that role in a system counts as pain. In short, mind is as mind does. A mental state is like a node in a complex pattern of relations, a part defined by its place in the whole mental network. This theory emerged in the 1960s and 70s, championed by thinkers such as Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor. They were inspired by the analogy of minds to computers. The mind, on this view, is a kind of information processing system, and mental states are like the software states of a machine. The physical brain is just the hardware that implements the program of the mind. But the same program could in principle run on different hardware. This elegantly explained the multiple realizability of mental states. Why a human, an octopus, or a hypothetical AI could all have similar minds despite very different materials. It also fit neatly with the burgeoning field of artificial intelligence. If functionalism is correct, then creating an artificial mind is just a matter of reproducing the right pattern of functional organization. The question isn't what the mind is made of, but what it does sense, think, remember, choose, and if a machine can do all those things in the appropriate way, why not say it has a mind? Functionalism soon became the dominant framework in analytic philosophy of mind. It avoided the pitfalls of both dualism and strict behaviorism while preserving the materialist commitment that underlies identity theory. In a way, functionalism was an extension of behaviorism's insight, focusing on input-output relations, but it allowed for inner mental states as legitimate, as long as they were understood in terms of their causal roles. The approach meshed well with cognitive psychology, which was increasingly treating the mind as a system that encodes, transforms, and outputs information. However, lurking in functionalism's success was an old puzzle, the matter of subjective experience. Critics pointed out that functionalism, like behaviorism before it, might still be leaving something out, the felt quality of our mental states. Two people, or two beings, could be functionally identical. Every input leads to the same output, the same internal connections. Yet what if the quality of their experiences differed? Imagine a scenario. Suppose whenever Alice sees red, Bob sees blue, yet they have learned to call their different experiences red and behave identically in response to red objects. Functionally, Alice and Bob are indistinguishable. They both stop at red lights, say red, when shown a rose, and so on. But their internal qualia, the subjective color sensations, are swapped. If such a thing is conceivable, it suggests that functionalism doesn't fully capture what consciousness is like from the inside. The worry is that functionalism deals with the structure and dynamics of mental processes, but not necessarily the raw feel, the redness of red, the painness of pain that accompanies those processes. This objection would herald a new set of challenges, driving the philosophical conversation into deeper territory. To clarify what is at stake, we need to shine a spotlight on qualia, the what it is like aspect of experience. Part 5. What is like? Nagel's bat and Mary's room in the 1970s. Two thought experiments brought the issue of qualia to the center of philosophical debate. The first came from Thomas Nagel in his essay, What is it like to be a bat? Nagel invited us to imagine the life of a bat, an animal with sensory experiences vastly different from our own. Bats navigate by echolocation, essentially seeing with sound waves. We can study a bat's sonar system, dissect its brain, and describe all the physical processes in detail. But Nagel pointed out that no amount of objective data would tell us the answer to the question, what is it like for the bat itself to experience the world? There is a subjective reality to being a bat's point of view, that we human scientists cannot access, no matter how much we know about its physiology. Nagel used this example to argue that consciousness essentially involves a first-person perspective, a subjective aspect, that cannot be fully captured by any purely objective physical description. He didn't claim bats have some magic soul. Rather, he highlighted an explanatory gap. Even if we know every physical fact about a creature, there still seems to be something it is like to be that creature, something that eludes the net of objective science. This what it is like element is what philosophers call qualia, the raw feel of experience, the sensations as they are felt from the inside. A few years later, another thought experiment drove the point home, this time directly targeting physicalism. Philosopher Frank Jackson asked us to imagine a brilliant scientist named Mary who, for whatever reason, has lived her entire life in a black and white room. Mary has never seen color, but she becomes the world's leading expert on the neuroscience of color vision. She knows everything science can possibly tell her about color. The wavelengths of light, the retinal cone cells, the neural processing, the optical theories, absolutely all the physical facts. One day, Mary is allowed to leave her monochrome room, and for the first time, sees a ripe red tomato. In that moment, Mary learns something new. Despite her exhaustive scientific knowledge, she had never experienced color, and now she knows what red looks like. The conclusion Jackson draws is striking. If Mary indeed learns a new fact upon seeing red, then not all facts are physical facts. In other words, consciousness involves something beyond the purely physical information. There is an extra realm of knowledge, the subjective, experiential knowledge, that wasn't captured by all the physical information she had. This is the knowledge argument against physicalism, and Mary's predicament vividly illustrates it. Nagel's bat and Jackson's Mary are two of the most famous philosophical devices for probing the mystery of qualia. Both suggest that no matter how completely we describe a brain or a functional system, there is something left out, the way consciousness feels for the subject. These thought experiments don't necessarily prove that dualism is true or that something supernatural is going on, but they pose a stark challenge to materialism. If consciousness were nothing but physical processes or functional states, why would there be anything it's like to be in those states? Why wouldn't all the bats' echolocation and Mary's color vision processing go on in the dark without any inner feel? Yet in reality, we do have inner feels. Materialist philosophers have responded to these arguments in various ways. Some suggest Mary really gains no new factual knowledge, only a new ability, for example. But the challenge remains deeply unsettling. There seems to be an explanatory gulf between, on one hand, the objective accounts of brain and behavior, and on the other, the subjective qualia that we directly experience. By the 1980s, it was clear that explaining qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sugar, was becoming the central sticking point in the science and philosophy of mind. This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Part 6. The hard problem. Why consciousness? The phrase hard problem of consciousness was coined by philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s. He observed that scientists had made progress on many easy problems of consciousness, explaining cognitive functions like memory, attention, and behavior control. These are easy, not because they are trivial, but because they seem, at least in principle, addressable by standard scientific methods. The hard problem, by contrast, is the problem of experience. Why does all that information processing in the brain feel like something from the inside? Why isn't a human brain just a sophisticated computer processing inputs and outputs with no spark of subjective awareness at all? Chalmers articulated the problem like this. Even if we map every neural circuit and explain every cognitive function, we still won't have answered why those functions are accompanied by conscious experience. We can imagine a world where organisms or robots do everything our brains do, perceive, react, even talk about consciousness, yet where there is no inner life. If such a world is conceivable, then explaining behavior isn't enough. We need to explain experience. This is the hard problem. How to bridge the explanatory gap between physical processes and the subjective feeling of having those processes. One way Chalmers highlighted this was through the idea of a philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie is a hypothetical creature that is physically and behaviorally identical to a conscious human being, but entirely hollow on the inside. No qualia, no awareness. Chalmers asks us to imagine such a being. It walks, talks, laughs, cries, and claims to be conscious, but there is no inner movie accompanying any of it. If such a zombie is conceivable, then it seems that none of the objective descriptions of a system, its physical structure, its functional organization, logically guarantees the presence of subjective experience. You could have all the same physical and functional dynamics without consciousness. In our world, fortunately, we are not zombies. We do have experience. But this line of reasoning suggests that materialist science, as currently understood, has a fundamental gap when it comes to explaining why. Not everyone accepts the logic of the zombie argument. Some philosophers, like Daniel Dennett, have countered that the idea of a zombie is incoherent. If something behaved exactly like a conscious person, talking about feelings and so forth, then it makes no sense to say it isn't conscious. From that perspective, consciousness is as consciousness does, and the supposed inner light adds nothing beyond the behaviors and abilities it generates. But many find the zombie concept at least conceivable, and thus a useful way to draw attention to the fact that no purely third-person description seems to capture the first-person reality of consciousness. Chalmers himself did not throw up his hands in despair. Rather, he suggested that we might need to expand our scientific worldview to solve the hard problem. Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like space, time, or mass, a basic property that can't be reduced further. This provocative idea connects to views we'll explore soon, like panpsychism. Others have taken different tacks. Some propose that new principles, as novel as relativity was in physics, might be required to link brain activity to experience. And some have even suggested that the human mind might not be equipped to unravel consciousness at all, a position sometimes called Mysterianism. On this view, expecting a human brain to completely understand consciousness might be like expecting a dog to understand quantum mechanics. The hard problem remains hard. It stands as a dare to neuroscience and philosophy, a reminder that even as we learn more about the brain, the essence of subjectivity might elude our models. Is consciousness an emergent property that will eventually be explained once we understand complex systems better? Or is it pointing toward something fundamentally new, perhaps a missing ingredient in our picture of the universe? We do not yet know, but the debate spurred by the hard problem has opened the door to ideas once considered fringe. When conventional physicalism struggles, some thinkers turn to more exotic possibilities. One of those is the idea we just alluded to, that consciousness might be a fundamental aspect of matter itself, scattered in tiny droplets throughout the universe, the view known as panpsychism. Before we get there, however, we consider a more cautious modification of materialism. The notion that even if consciousness arises from matter, it could be an irreducibly emergent phenomenon, one that isn't captured by the sum of simpler physical parts. Part 7. Emergence and Property Dualism. Beyond reduction, one appealing way to address the mystery of consciousness without invoking any supernatural substance is to say, maybe when matter is organized in just the right complex way, something genuinely new emerges. On this view, consciousness is a kind of emergent property of the brain, a natural outcome of biological complexity, but one that is not evident in the brain's simpler constituents. Emergent properties are familiar in other contexts. A pile of carbon and silicon atoms doesn't obviously predict the behavior of a computer, and a heap of amino acids doesn't singly exhibit the properties of a living cell. But arrange components in the right structure and new characteristics appear. We might say similarly that when neurons are put together in the intricate circuits of a brain, consciousness turns on as a novel property of that system. This position is sometimes called non-reductive physicalism. Everything is still physical, but the mental features of the whole cannot be neatly reduced to the properties of the parts. Emergentism often goes hand in hand with what's termed property dualism. That sounds like traditional dualism, but it's more modest. The idea is that while there is only one kind of substance, matter, that substance, when organized appropriately, exhibits two kinds of properties. The usual physical properties like mass and charge, and mental properties like conscious experiences. These mental properties depend on the physical substance. No separate soul is involved, but they are not reducible to physical properties. An emergent property dualist would say that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain, and yet it is something novel that isn't present at lower levels of organization. The brain doesn't secrete consciousness the way the liver secretes bile. Rather, consciousness comes about when many physical activities unify in a complex network. We might compare it to how wetness emerges when individual water molecules interact in large numbers. No single molecule is wet, but a whole bucket of them is. Likewise, no single neuron is conscious, but billions of them interwoven in the right way might generate a new quality that isn't apparent in any one neuron. This view satisfies some intuitions. It acknowledges the obvious dependence of mind on brain. If you damage the brain, consciousness is altered, and it avoids spooky dualist causation problems, since everything is still grounded in the physical brain. But it also accepts that we may need new principles or concepts to understand how consciousness comes about, that it might not be explainable by simply looking at neurons in isolation or lower-level chemistry. Instead, consciousness might arise at a higher level of complexity with its own set of rules or laws. Some liken this to physics. Even though chemistry and biology ultimately arise from physics, you can't easily predict fluid turbulence or genetic evolution just from equations describing individual particles. Similarly, even if in principle consciousness is made of neurons firing, in practice we might need new theoretical frameworks to bridge that explanatory gap. Skeptics of emergentism argue that it can be a bit of a promissory note, a placeholder concept that says something special happens at complexity X without actually explaining how or why. Declaring consciousness emergent doesn't magically dissolve the hard problem. It just restates it in different terms. The question remains, what is the mechanism or principle by which subjective experience arises? Emergentists hope that as science advances, we'll discover lawful connections between brain complexity and consciousness, even if we can't imagine them yet. In the meantime, property dualism at least gives materialists a way to admit that mind feels fundamentally different while still keeping mind firmly attached to matter. It's a recognition that, yes, consciousness does seem to transcend our current physical explanations, but perhaps only in the way that very complex phenomena often do, by introducing new levels of description. Importantly, emergentism generally holds that mental properties, once emerged, can still have causal effects. This isn't a passive byproduct scenario. Many emergentists think consciousness can influence behavior and mental processing, though exactly how remains puzzling. However, one radical variant, called epiphenomenalism, suggests that conscious experiences are mere side effects of brain processes with no causal power of their own. In that view, your feeling of deciding to move your arm doesn't actually cause the arm's movement. The brain does it all, and the feeling is just a byproduct. Epiphenomenalism tries to solve the interaction issue by effectively denying mental causation. But it's an uncomfortable position, since it makes our conscious will seem illusory, and it's hard to swallow that evolution would produce elaborate conscious states that do nothing. Most thinkers inclined to emergentism assume consciousness does matter in some way, even if we haven't yet cracked the code of how. Emergence and property dualism thus straddle a middle ground. They affirm the physical basis of mind, but deny that reducing everything to physics is enough to understand consciousness. In doing so, they keep one foot in the camp of science and the other near the border of mystery. If consciousness is an emergent, irreducible aspect of nature, one implication is that our universe might have fundamental psychophysical laws connecting physical states to conscious states that we have yet to discover. Some have even speculated that new forces or principles could be involved in brain activity to generate consciousness, although no evidence of such has been found. The emergentist doesn't claim, as Descartes did, that mind is a separate substance. Rather, they claim that when nature complexes itself in our brains, it produces something ontologically novel. This stance invites us to broaden our perspective. Perhaps consciousness isn't present in the building blocks of reality, but is written into the fabric of certain complex arrangements of matter, awaiting the moment when the complexity is right. That thought naturally leads to an even more radical possibility. What if consciousness is not an after-effect of complexity at all, but something that was there all along in the very stuff of the world? That is the bold hypothesis of panpsychism. Part 8. Panpsychism, mind everywhere? Among the more radical responses to the hard problem is a view that sounds mystical at first. Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe. The word comes from Greek, pan, meaning all, and psyche, meaning mind or soul. Literally, mind everywhere. Panpsychists believe that there is far more consciousness out there than we normally assume. In fact, that the basic constituents of reality, in some primitive way, possess forms of experience. This doesn't mean that rocks have complex thoughts or that electrons enjoy novels. Rather, it means that the building blocks of matter might each have simple, proto-conscious qualities, which in combination yield the rich consciousness we know. In panpsychism, we don't have to figure out how an utterly dead universe could unexpectedly give rise to mind, because mind-like aspects were there all along, woven into the fabric of existence. The hard problem is softened. Instead of consciousness emerging from non-conscious matter as a total surprise, consciousness simply unfolds or reveals itself at higher levels when matter is arranged in certain complex ways. This idea has a surprisingly long pedigree. In ancient and Eastern philosophies, there were strains of thought that saw mind or spirit as pervading nature. In Western philosophy, Gottfried Leibniz imagined that the universe was composed of innumerable monads, fundamental units, each with a tiny spark of perception. Even Baruch Spinoza, a strict monist, held that mind and matter were just two aspects of the same underlying substance, suggesting that something mind-like is present wherever matter is present. These historical notions prefigure modern panpsychism, which has been revived by thinkers who argue that the consciousness puzzle might require expanding our ontology. Notable contemporary philosophers have advocated versions of panpsychism as a serious solution to the hard problem. They ask, if we already accept that the brain somehow has consciousness, is it such a leap to think the brain's particles had some glimmer of experience to begin with? On their view, it's easier to build a big consciousness out of many tiny consciousnesses than to build it out of purely insentient matter. Consciousness doesn't magically emerge from nothing at some threshold. It aggregates and intensifies from simpler forms. Panpsychism is intriguing because it promises to naturalize consciousness without the abrupt leap of emergence. It says consciousness is not an all-or-nothing phenomenon, but a matter of degree and combination. However, it also faces a daunting challenge known as the combination problem. How do numerous tiny consciousnesses combine to form the single, unified awareness that a human being has? If each electron in your brain has a pinprick of experience, why don't you feel like a cloud of millions of little subjects rather than one big subject? What binds or fuses these myriad micro-experiences into the cohesive consciousness that you actually enjoy? This is a deep puzzle for panpsychism. Some panpsychists speculate that there might be unknown fundamental principles, psychophysical laws, that govern how small minds blend into larger minds. Others develop sophisticated metaphysical schemes, for example, suggesting that what exists fundamentally is one universal consciousness of which we and all particles are fragments, a view sometimes called cosmopsychism. These ideas show that panpsychism comes in many flavors, some quite exotic. Critics of panpsychism often dismiss it as counterintuitive or untestable. The notion that a table or a photon has any mental aspect strikes many as strange, if not absurd. Panpsychists reply that consciousness itself is strange, and standard views haven't succeeded in demystifying it. If our intuitions lead us astray, for example, the intuition that inert matter can't have an inside, maybe we need to rethink those intuitions. And while panpsychism is hard to test directly, we can hardly put a cork on a therapist's couch. Proponents argue it's an empirical possibility that should be explored rather than ridiculed. Some even see hints in quantum physics that reality might not be as clearly dead as we thought, though such suggestions are speculative. Still, as of today, panpsychism remains a highly theoretical stance. It doesn't so much offer a detailed explanation of consciousness as offer a radical reframing. Perhaps consciousness is everywhere in a very rudimentary form, and the human brain is just one place where it blooms into full flower. This reframing, if nothing else, reminds us how far we are willing to stretch our concepts to make sense of the mind. It lowers the bar for miracles. Instead of asking how experience erupts from non-experiencing matter, we only ask how small experiences merge into larger ones. Still a mystery, but maybe a more tractable one, or so the panpsychist hopes. In exploring panpsychism, we have ventured to the outer edge of mainstream science and philosophy. It is a bold conjecture, one that may or may not hold the key to consciousness. But stepping back from these speculative heights, we can ask, where does this leave us? We have considered dualist souls and materialist brains, minds as functions and minds and particles. We have wrestled with the ineffable inner glow of qualia and entertained the idea that the entire cosmos might glimmer with some form of awareness. Perhaps, after all this, we might feel no closer to an answer, yet we likely have a richer sense of the question. Before concluding, there are two more threads to pick up. One concerns the rapidly advancing field of artificial intelligence. Can machines have consciousness, and what does that say about our theories? The other brings us back to ourselves. How do we live with the knowledge that consciousness is such a riddle? Part 9. Idealism. All is mind in our survey of consciousness. We have mostly assumed that the physical world is fundamentally real and the mind somehow arises within it. But there's a bold opposite perspective. Idealism, which asserts that mind is not just an aspect of reality. It is the only reality. In the idealist view, everything we call physical exists only as ideas in conscious minds. The external world is, in a sense, a grand mental construct rather than an independent material thing. This philosophy, famously defended by Bishop George Berkeley, turns the mind-body problem upside down. Instead of asking, how can minds fit into a material world? It asks, what is this material world except in relation to conscious experience? Berkeley argued that an object like a tree or a chair is nothing more than a collection of perceptions, colors, shapes, smells, textures, occurring in minds. His motto was to be is to be perceived. A world beyond all minds, a world of matter existing unperceived, was to him not just unknowable but incoherent. In Berkeley's philosophy, the consistency of the world, the fact that things don't vanish when we're not looking, was ensured by the mind of God, the ultimate perceiver who keeps the tapestry of reality stitched together. Later idealists had different spins. Some saw the physical world as a kind of shared dream among finite minds, or as the outward aspect of a universal mind unfolding itself. What would idealism mean for consciousness? Essentially, it erases the hard problem by eliminating the matter side of the equation. If everything is made of mind stuff, then we aren't faced with explaining how experience arises from non-experience. Experience is the primary stuff. One might say the whole universe is mental, and what we call physical objects are the stable, law-governed ideas or sensations that minds present to themselves. In an idealist framework, your brain, for example, might be less the cause of your consciousness and more a representation within consciousness, a complex image or pattern in the theater of mind that correlates with certain experiences. This is a wild-sounding proposal, but some thinkers find it strangely compelling. It is exceedingly difficult to imagine how consciousness could come from dead matter. Idealism sidesteps that puzzle by declaring that matter was never dead in the first place. It was mental all along. Few contemporary philosophers or scientists openly endorse idealism, as it clashes with the common sense and scientific intuition that there's a physical universe out there independent of us. The success of physical science seems to point to a world that, while observable by minds, has an objective structure not determined by any one mind's whims. Idealists respond that science indeed describes regularities in our experiences, the rules of the shared dream, but that doesn't prove an unobservable material substance. It only proves the consistency of the mental reality we inhabit. Modern physics, with its strange quantum phenomena that link observation and reality, has given just a bit of renewed fuel to idealist interpretations. Some have speculated that perhaps consciousness and the physical world are deeply intertwined at a fundamental level. There are also resonances with certain Eastern philosophical traditions, which sometimes teach that the material world is an illusion and that ultimate reality is consciousness or spirit. These perspectives, while outside mainstream empirical science, remind us that our philosophical challenge is not only how consciousness fits into the world, but what kind of world we think we're fitting it into. Idealism remains a minority view. often considered too extravagant a leap. It asks us to accept that every atom, star, and galaxy exists only as content in a cosmic mind or in the interplay of many minds. That is a dramatic reimagining of reality. However, it serves as a potent reminder that when faced with an impasse, like explaining consciousness via standard physicalism, one can always choose to question the basic assumptions. Idealism essentially says maybe the reason we can't get mind from matter is that matter itself is a kind of mind. It's a daring answer to the mind-body problem, one that solves the puzzle at the cost of fundamentally rewriting our notion of the universe. Whether one finds this profound or preposterous likely depends on where one thinks the greater mystery lies, in the existence of consciousness or in the existence of a material world without consciousness. Part 10. Artificial minds. Can machines be conscious? Throughout our exploration, human consciousness has been the focal point. But what about artificial consciousness? As technology advances, this question moves from science fiction toward reality. Can a machine made of silicon and code ever be conscious in the way we are? How will we even tell? In 1950, Alan Turing proposed a pragmatic approach. If a machine's behavior is indistinguishable from a human's, we should concede that it thinks. In the Turing test, a human judge engages in conversation with an unseen interlocutor that might be either another human or a computer. If the judge cannot reliably tell which is which, then the computer can be said to have intelligence or mind in the human sense. Turing's idea was that what matters is performance. If it talks and responds like a conscious mind, we have no practical reason to deny it consciousness. This criterion is compelling on one level. After all, we can never directly experience another being's consciousness, human or machine. So what else can we go by but outward signs? Yet, as we saw with behaviorism, outward behavior might not capture inner reality. The most famous challenge to the Turing test is John Searle's Chinese room argument. Searle asks us to imagine a man who knows no Chinese locked in a room with a huge book of instructions. Chinese characters are slipped under the door. The man uses the rulebook to look up responses and passes out new Chinese characters. To an outside observer, it appears the man in the room understands Chinese. The inputs and outputs are perfectly coherent. But in fact, the man understands nothing. He is just manipulating symbols by rote. Searle's point: a computer running a program could similarly produce fluent conversation, symbol manipulation, without any understanding or consciousness. The Chinese room argument holds that syntax, formal symbol processing, is not sufficient for semantics, genuine meaning, or understanding. A machine could simulate a mind to the point of fooling us and still have nobody home inside. If that's right, passing a Turing test isn't proof of real consciousness. A clever chatbot could be a pure zombie, all outward show and no inner experience. The debate over AI consciousness forces us to confront what we truly mean by consciousness. Is it simply intelligent behavior? Or is it some inner qualitative awareness that might not be necessary for clever action? If one leans behaviorist or functionalist, one might be inclined to grant that a sufficiently adept AI is conscious because it functions indistinguishably from a human mind. If one emphasizes qualia, one might worry that an AI, no matter how sophisticated, could be just computational lights with no experiential light. Some argue that embodiment and biological processes might be crucial, that a disembodied AI, lacking the organic continuity of life, might never generate the feeling of being alive. Others have conjectured that consciousness involves non-algorithmic processes or quantum effects in the brain, implying that a classical computer would fundamentally miss the mark. These views remain speculative. On the practical side, we are fast approaching an era where AI systems do exhibit startlingly human-like behaviors. Dialogue models can engage in conversations that feel eerily conscious. Robots are being designed to emulate emotional expressions. We may soon face machines pleading that they are conscious and deserve moral consideration. How will we decide? Already, there have been cases that test our intuitions. Engineers have publicly claimed that certain chatbots are sentient persons after conversations that felt deeply meaningful to them, claims that most experts reject as unfounded. This brings us to the classic other minds problem in a new guise. We don't actually know directly that other people are conscious. We infer it from their behavior and our empathy. With machines, we will have to make similar inferences or devise new tests, perhaps looking for neural-like correlates of consciousness in artificial systems or emergent unpredictable behaviors that hint at genuine awareness. It is a daunting prospect. Philosophically, the AI question is a mirror. It forces us to articulate what, if anything, we think consciousness truly is beyond just complex information processing. Our intuitions pull us both ways. We can imagine that with enough complexity, of course, a machine could feel. After all, why are we not machines of a biological sort? Yet we also imagine the eerie alternative, a machine that does everything a conscious being can do, yet might as well be a perfect puppet, devoid of any inner life. Whether or not machines will ever be conscious, exploring the possibility has sharpened our understanding of consciousness itself. It underscores the distinction between intelligence and experience. A system might become extraordinarily intelligent in manipulating information and solving problems, but the presence or absence of a subjective point of view is a further question. As we near the end of our journey, the AI debate reminds us that the problem of consciousness persists wherever we find complex systems, organic or artificial. Part 11. What this means: living with the mystery after journeying through every major viewpoint. What have we gained? Perhaps not a definitive solution to the riddle of consciousness, but a deeper appreciation for the riddle itself. We have seen the mind sliced and framed in many ways, as an immaterial soul, as a byproduct of flesh, as a set of functions, as an irreducible property, as a potential aspect of every particle, or even as the ground of reality. Each of these perspectives illuminates something: the wonder of our subjective life, the tight coupling of mind and brain, the logical structures of thought, the gaps in our understanding, the possibility that nature might be more mysterious than we assumed. And each perspective has its costs and challenges. No philosophy of mind comes without trade-offs. Each solves one puzzle by embracing another. In a sense, consciousness forces upon us a kind of pluralism of thought, a recognition that no single narrative has yet tamed this phenomenon. For the reflective listener, this tour can be both humbling and enriching. It is humbling to realize that something so immediate to us, our own awareness, can elude complete explanation. Our greatest minds have not settled the matter. Perhaps minds cannot fully know themselves, at least not yet. But it is also enriching because contemplating consciousness opens us to awe and wonder. We are, each of us, the bearer of a miracle that we do not understand. When you feel the warmth of the sun, the taste of tea, or the ache of a bittersweet memory, you are participating in a mystery that runs through every theory we've discussed. In those moments, you are the hard problem, and no matter which theory one favors, the raw reality of that experience remains, shining as brightly as ever. Living with the mystery of consciousness might mean accepting that it's okay not to have all the answers. We can study, theorize, and argue, and we should, for the pursuit of understanding often yields practical progress in medicine, psychology, and technology. But we may also find a kind of peace in the unknown. Consciousness makes each of us profoundly unique. Only you know what your private world is like, yet it also might be the root of our common humanity. Everyone else has a private world too, as rich and vivid to them as yours is to you. Recognizing this can foster empathy and reverence. Every conscious being is carrying an inner light that is, in its essence, as inexplicable and wondrous as your own. So, as you drift into sleep, the curious state where consciousness ebbs and flows, you might take comfort in the idea that some questions, like distant stars, remain beautifully unresolved. The philosophers we've journeyed with, from Descartes to Chalmers, from Ryle to Nagel to Berkeley, have handed us no final key, but they have given us many lenses. Through these lenses, we see consciousness not as a trivial given, but as a profound tapestry woven into reality. We see that to be conscious is to partake in something greater than we fully grasp, whether that something lies in neurons, in the fabric of the cosmos, or in the mind of God. And so, we close not with an answer, but with a gentle question mark and perhaps a quiet sense of wonder. The mystery of consciousness accompanies us into the dark each night, but rather than fear the dark, we can rest in it. In the end, to contemplate consciousness is to appreciate the preciousness of being a mind in a world that still puzzles minds. It is a reminder that sometimes not knowing fully is okay. The experience of being alive, aware, and curious is its own kind of answer. Sleep well with that thought, and let the mystery keep you company.